Hey, Hershey Free, I wanted to give you this update from the recent tour that a group of our people from our church took to Israel. And here's how I want to do this. I'm not going to take time to show you all the places we visited, but I do want to show you 4 sites that we visited. And as we talk about these 4 sites, I want you to see them as really examples of how archaeology and geography can help us understand the Bible. So here are 4 sites that we visited during this recent trip, and in each of these sites there are ways in which they enhance our understanding of Scripture. Now here's the first place that I want to tell you about. It's a place called Tel Megiddo. Now if you study biblical archaeology, if you end up going to Israel at some point, you're going to discover that there are multiple sites that the first word in their name is this word Tel. So let me start by kind of explaining what a tel is. And the best way to describe a tel is this. What a tel is, it's a mound that has gone through multiple layers of occupation. In other words, many of these sites in ancient Israel were places that were inhabited over centuries, even millennia. And over time, the city would perhaps be abandoned or destroyed by an enemy, then it would be rebuilt, and that happens over and over and over again, so that there are multiple levels of occupation, and as a result, it becomes a mound. And this is true of Megiddo. So here's an aerial picture of Megiddo. You see it's this big mound, and today, archaeologists have discovered really 30 levels of occupation at this site. And you can see different parts of this site have been excavated to different levels. Now, 2 things I want to highlight about this site, Tel Megiddo, for you. And the first really is this. The first has to do with the water system. Now, as you go through this city, you discover that in its history, it was a well-fortified location. And in fact, here's the gate complex from the time of Solomon. The Bible tells us that Solomon fortified the city, and here's the archaeological evidence of that. It's a multi-chambered gate complex. And so this city was well fortified. But even as the city was well fortified in terms of its walls, it had a phenomenal water system. And you can still tour that water system today. This is our group going down. You have to go down about 180 steps. And then as you go down and continue to go down, you eventually hit a tunnel that was dug to the spring. And of course, the purpose of this water system was to be able to bring water into the city and make that available to the people. And this was particularly important if the city were ever under siege. Because the reality is this: no matter how strong your walls were, if you didn't have water, you were in deep trouble. And I wanted to show you this because this is an example of the very intricate attention that is given at multiple locations in Israel to the concept of water. How do we get water? In the ancient world, particularly in Israel, because much of it is more arid, you're always wondering, how do you get water? And so a number of these sites have intricate water systems. And I think that helps us read Scripture differently because it shows us how important the imagery of water is. For instance, think about this passage from Psalm 1, right? Where the psalmist is talking about the person who's wise and said that person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. So when you experience Israel and these intricate water systems, it reminds you that in the ancient world, you've had to pay attention to where you get water from. And that shows us how powerful this image is in the pages of Scripture. Even Jesus talking about providing streams of living water. So the first thing I wanted to really show you about Megiddo is the water system. Now, the second thing I wanted to tell you about this site is this. You're already familiar with it. You already know about this place. Now I realize you're saying, no, George, I've never heard of it. I've never heard of any place called Tel Megiddo. What do you mean I'm familiar with it? No, in fact, you're already familiar with this place. In fact, at times you probably reference this location. You just didn't realize it. To show you what I mean, let me take you to the book of Revelation, one of the most famous images in the book of Revelation is found in Revelation 16. And here's what we read, right? It speaks of the peoples gathering for a final battle against God. And what does it say? Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called what? Armageddon. So what does Armageddon mean? In Hebrew, it means Mount of Megiddo. Now, to understand the significance of this imagery in Revelation, it's helpful to understand the geography of Megiddo. So let me show you this map. In the northern part of Israel, there is a valley known as the Jezreel Valley, and it cuts across the entirety of the country. And there are mountains, hills to the north in Galilee, and then there are mountains, hills to the south in Judea and Samaria. And as a result, this location was strategic because it was the natural location for major trade routes. In fact, one of the most famous trade routes in the ancient world was known as the Way of the Sea. And that Way of the Sea goes right past Megiddo. It connects Egypt to the south with Mesopotamia to the northeast. There were also trade routes going up along the coast to Phoenicia and ultimately to Europe. So Megiddo is located in this valley, and in a real sense, this was like the traffic center of the ancient world. This was the location that connected trade routes that could take you to 3 different continents. And due to that strategic location, it was also an area that was fought over time after time after time. The earliest known military conflict in this region dates back to the time of the pharaohs. The most recent military conflict in this region dates to the time of World War I. Napoleon marched his armies through this valley. The author Mark Twain once visited this region, and he was familiar with some of the history. And as he talked about this region, this Jezreel Valley around Megiddo, he said, "This is the battlefield of the nations." Now, when you understand the geographical significance of this valley, which ultimately is the Valley of Armageddon, it makes sense to understand the imagery in Revelation to say, well, of course, this is the place where the armies of the world gather ultimately to confront God, because this has been a site of military conflict for thousands upon thousands of years. Now, in telling you about this valley, let me just tell you a personal story, my own experience with this valley. Because this is the city of Megiddo. If you go a little farther, there's another city that guards an entrance to this valley, and that city is a place called Yokneam. In 1982, I was working as a volunteer at the archaeological excavations at Yokneam. Now, this mountain at the bottom of the screen, this is Yokneam, and it's known as Tel Yokneam because it's gone through multiple levels of occupation. And it just so happens that in 1982, that was the same summer that Israel conducted major military operations in southern Lebanon to clean out terrorist camps. And the Air Force base they used for those military operations is right here in this valley. And I still have memories, as a 17-year-old, as a teenager, standing on this hill and watching planes fly out of this military base and thinking to myself, I'm watching military aircraft go into active combat right out of the Valley of Armageddon. And for me as a kid, that was like, this is just too much of the Bible coming to life. So this is the first site that I wanted to show you, and this is Tel Megiddo. Now let's go farther north. Let's think more about the ministry of Jesus, and let's go to the place that really was his home base, a place called Capernaum. If we go kind of north and east, we come to the Sea of Galilee, and here's the city of Capernaum. It was located really along the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and this was the heart of the fishing industry at that time, and it was a major industry. In fact, there were exports that were coming out of this area, fish being exported to other parts of the Roman world. And this was really the area where so much of Jesus's earthly ministry took place. And in a real sense, this area was away from major population centers. It was away from Caesarea by the sea, kind of the Roman center. It was away from Jerusalem, the Jewish center. But Jesus' location and ministry in this area, as Matthew tells us, fulfilled biblical prophecy. In Matthew 4, we read this. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah. Of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people living in darkness have seen a great light. And those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. So Jesus' ministry is concentrated kind of in this out-of-the-way place along the northern shores of the Sea of Galilee. But in doing so, it fulfills prophecy that this would be the place where a light to the Gentiles would come. Now, when you visit Capernaum, the first thing you see, first thing you really notice, is this magnificent synagogue. It's one of the most impressive synagogues that have been discovered in Israel. But this actually dates much later than the time of Jesus. It's usually dated to the 4th or 5th century AD. And the rest of the site is really less impressive architecturally. So kind of right next to the synagogue is an area that during the 1st century would have been an area of residences. This would have been a neighborhood in the time of Jesus. And you see all of these dark stones. The reality is there's a lot of basalt rock, volcanic rock in this region of Galilee, and that was used for construction. And so this would have been an area of homes where the walls of the homes would have been built with this rock, and then there would have been probably a frame on top with thatch and tile for flat-roofed homes. And here again, you see what this neighborhood would have looked like, and you can kind of imagine what the walls of these small homes look like, and you can get a sense that the neighborhood was very tight and very compact, and that helps us understand. Remember the story in the Gospels where Jesus is actually teaching and healing in the city, and these individuals bring their friend for Jesus to heal him, and they can't get into the house, and so they have to go up on the flat roof and tear a hole in the roof and lower him down. And maybe at some point you wondered, well, why couldn't they get into the house? Well, when you see this reality of what the architecture was like in that neighborhood, you realize things were very tight. It would have been easy for people to be crowded in the streets and neighborhoods, and it would have been hard to get in. So you begin to understand the reality of why that story unfolded the way it did. As you walk around this city and the remains, the architectural remains, you will notice there are a lot of tools made out of basalt stone, particularly millstones. And this is one of those. And you see a number of them around this site. And there's so many that have been discovered here that many archaeologists have concluded that these stones were actually manufactured in Capernaum, that this was part of the local industry, the manufacturing of these millstones. And I think that helps us understand this passage from the life of Jesus. And we know from Matthew that this conversation took place in Capernaum. Do you remember the scene? Jesus is warning others about not causing his followers to stumble. And he says, if anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. My guess is at some point you said, that's just a weird image. Where do you come up with an analogy like that? But I think when we understand the archaeology of Capernaum, this starts to make sense. Now, interestingly, this phrase is normally translated large millstone, and that's a fine translation. But a more literal translation is this. It's a millstone of a donkey. And so what that was referring to was the idea that a pole would have been put through this millstone, and it would have been a donkey that was moving around the entire grinding apparatus that would have been driving it. So this is what that would have looked like. So this is how it would have worked. And this is the large millstone that Jesus is talking about. Now there's one other thing I want you to notice about this millstone. I took the picture from a different angle. So here's the millstone I just showed you. But what I want you to notice, if you look carefully in the background, this is the Sea of Galilee. And I think this picture tells us something about the mastery of Jesus' teaching. Because I think it's quite possible, as Jesus is telling this saying, that when he talks about a millstone, he's actually able to point to a millstone. And then when he talks about the sea, he's actually pointing to the sea. In other words, the people who heard this saying for the first time actually had in their view both the millstone and the sea that Jesus is referencing. And so one of the things this shows us about the teaching of Jesus was just the brilliance with which he used everyday objects, things that were already part of people's lives. And of course, if these stones were being manufactured in Capernaum and you're living in Capernaum, you're used to seeing them. So he's using imagery from everyday life experience and applying it in a particular spiritual direction. So this is one of the things that we learn as we visit Capernaum. The next place that I want to show you is a place called Beit Shan. Now, it's not a significant biblical site, but I do think it's important, and I'll explain why in a moment. But what Beit Shan is, it's an excellent example of what a Roman city was like. So we were previously looking at Capernaum at the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. If we come south, here's the bottom part of the Sea of Galilee, and we follow the Jordan River Valley, and we come to this place called Beit Shan. And it was a place that was heavily developed by the Romans over several centuries. And here's an aerial drone shot of what this city was like. And it had things that were very typical of larger Roman cities. It had a theater. It had a bathhouse. It had the major road known as the Cardo. When Romans built cities, they often built a major road north-south that was referred to the Cardo, like cardiac or heart. It was the heart of the city. And then there would often be a major cross street like this one called a decumanus. And that was just the standard way that the Romans planned urban environments. As I said, there would have been a bathhouse here. There would have been shops along the major road. There was also a temple here. It's a pagan city, right? And even a major fountain here that would have brought fresh water into the city. And when you walk through this site, in different ways, you are impressed with the Romans' way to build cities effectively. For instance, as you walk down that main street, one of the things you notice is that the street is pitched. It's pitched in the middle so that it would foster better drainage. And this street would have been heavily trafficked, often by chariots, and then along the side of the street, in essence, was this sidewalk, which was more utilized for people traffic. And then along the sidewalk, there would have been different shops and places to do business. So it's a very well-organized city. And in addition to this very effective infrastructure for commerce and business, there was just effective use of water and even sanitation. So this is a picture of one of the Roman bathhouses here, and the floor would have been at this level, and they would have pumped hot air underneath to heat the house to make it a sauna. So it was part of a very intricate way to help people take care of themselves. Furthermore, one of the things our group really enjoyed was visiting the public bathrooms. This is what a Roman public toilet looked like. And of course, there was a very intricate sanitation system underneath with water running underneath. And the reason I wanted to show you this city was to think in these terms. Here's what I appreciate about Beit Shan. It is this. I think Beit Shan helps us understand what it was like for the message of Jesus to go out into the broader Roman world. Now, the truth is, the Roman world was very pagan, and of course, you see that when you walk through this city because it had pagan temples. But the flip side is also the reality that the brilliant infrastructure that the Romans created, from transportation to commerce to sanitation, the infrastructure that they created actually made the spread of the gospel possible. I mean, Paul and other early Christian missionaries, they could go into a new city and they would know how the city was constructed. They would know how the city worked and where to find shops, and they would have access to good water. And so these infrastructure factors actually created the opportunity for the message of Jesus to go out and to grow in an exponential way. And that's exactly what happened. And one of the reasons I like to keep this in mind is I think even today it's possible for us to look around at our culture and only see the negative dimensions without being attuned to opportunities that may be in front of us. So Beit Shan shows how the gospel actually utilized the strengths of the Roman Empire to spread. And I think there's something that we can learn from that. Now, the final place I want to take you to, the fourth site, is Jerusalem. And of course, we could spend hours upon hours talking about different dimensions of Jerusalem, but here's what I want to focus on. I want to focus on the Temple Mount. Now, Herod the Great was a great builder. And this temple is really, in so many ways, one of his crowning achievements. This temple that he built was one of the most impressive architectural accomplishments in the ancient world. To make the temple the size that he wanted, he had his architects build a 35-acre platform. And it was the largest of its kind when it was built by Herod the Great. And let me just show you some pictures from various places along the excavations of this area. Maybe you've heard of the Western Wall. Sometimes Christians refer to it as the Wailing Wall. It's a place where Jews pray and they put prayer requests in the cracks between the stones. And that would have been this part of the retaining wall of Herod's temple. So here is a picture of that, and it's a very sacred place in Judaism today. More recently, and by that I mean really over the last 30 years, extensive excavation has been done farther along this western wall, this western retaining wall of what would have been Herod's temple. And you can now do tours underneath the city that follow really the foundation stones of this temple. And so here's our group kind of preparing to go along those retaining wall tours. And this is our group in front of what has been identified as the largest stone in the foundation of Herod's temple. It's a large stone, and this is incredible to think about. It's estimated to be over 500 tons. Estimated to be about 570 tons originally. So it is amazing work of architecture. There's one other part of this Temple Mount that I want to show you, and that involves these steps. These are sometimes referred to as the southern steps of the Temple Mount. This would have been the major entrance in and out of the temple during the time of Jesus. So when we talk about Jesus entering the temple in different passages, it most likely would have occurred around here. This was just a natural place for people to go in and out of the temple. It was the most frequently used. This is a picture of the archaeological work done on those southern steps. And as you see these southern steps, I want to remind you of one scene from the life of Jesus and his disciples. We read about this in Mark 13. And this is occurring during that final week leading up to Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. And we read this: as Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. Do you see all of these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." Now let's just go back for a moment. I think it's quite likely that that conversation took place right here, somewhere along these steps. They're coming out of the temple. And again, this is one of the great architectural feats of the ancient world. And one of his disciples looks up and just marvels. Says, "Man, isn't this an amazing building? Look at the construction." And from their perspective, this amazing place represented the presence of God. And look at these massive stones that communicate so much. But, as you read this passage, Jesus is not impressed. Right? All he says is, look, not one stone here will be left on another. And ultimately what he is doing, he's predicting he's predicting the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, of Herod's temple, which would take place in AD 70 by the Romans. And interestingly, as you walk around that corner of the southern part of the Temple Mount, you can actually see signs of the Roman destruction. You can see where the archaeologists simply left these stones as they discovered them. They have been pushed over by the Romans during the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So Jesus' words proved profitable, and his prophecy came true. Now, as you think about that conversation that Jesus had with his disciples, quite possibly on these steps, you need to understand that was very disorienting for them. In fact, we read later that when they're on the Mount of Olives, which is over here, they brought it back up. I think they had been troubled by what Jesus said. I mean, he was talking about the destruction of the temple that represented God's presence. How could that be, and what did that mean? And I think ultimately what Jesus was helping his disciples to realize is they needed to understand how to think about the theme of God's temple. Now think about how the theme of temple occurs in Scripture. In the creation account, we see God creating a garden. And the author of Genesis describes that garden as a temple. Then, of course, sin and brokenness enter the world, and people are kicked out of God's presence. And really the rest of the storyline of the Bible revolves around the question, how can we get back into God's presence again? How can this relationship be restored? And as God puts a rescue plan in place, we have the tabernacle, and then we have the temple that Solomon builds, and these places that signify God's presence among his people. But then we get to the New Testament, and John tells us that God's presence is now at work through Jesus himself. The Word has become flesh and dwelt or tabernacled among us. And through his own ministry, Jesus anticipates the coming of his Spirit. And through the coming of his Spirit, God's presence is now going to dwell among his people. And so I think part of what Jesus is doing, he's preparing his disciples for the reality that the ultimate building of God's temple is now going to be the development of his church. And of course, then we get to the end of the biblical storyline. We see the new heavens and the new earth, and there is no temple because God's presence among his people has been fully restored. And I think Peter, who probably was very confused when he heard this conversation on the southern steps of the temple, slowly comes to realize what Jesus was getting at. Because toward the end of his life and ministry, right, he writes 1 Peter. And what do we read in 1 Peter? He says, as you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like a spiritual house, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Right? Peter is coming to understand and recognize that, wait a minute, God's now building a new temple, and that temple is his people. And so, as I stand, at the times I've stood on this area of the Temple Mount and stood on these southern steps, I can almost envision a conversation with Peter that goes something like this. I can envision Peter saying something to us like, I once stood on these steps, and as we marveled at the temple behind us, Jesus told us it was all coming tumbling down. And I didn't get it at the time. And that was very confusing and disorienting for me to hear what he was saying about these stones. But I've now come to understand through the work of his Spirit that this isn't the ultimate temple. That God is now building a new temple. And as impressive as this building was with its architecture, with all of its achievements, he's now building a greater temple. And that temple involves you and me. So this is a very powerful lesson, I think, that we can learn from the southern steps of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So here are 4 sites that we visited on our recent trip to Israel, and I think 4 sites that help us understand how archaeology and geography enhance our reading of Scripture. Now, as we've come back and I've had interactions with different people, one of the questions I've gotten is this: are you going to do this at some time or some point again? And the answer is we're very open to doing that again, but to do wise planning, it would be helpful to know who might be interested. So if you would say, yeah, I would really be interested perhaps over the next couple of years in going to Israel, or you would say, I'd just like to know more information about a potential trip if you have one, please let me know, gdavis@hersheyfree.com. So having your information would just be helpful. There's no obligation. It's just helpful to know who might be interested. So I hope this journey through 4 sites of Israel has been intriguing for you, educational for you, and I hope it's encouraged you to see not only the way archaeology and geography enhance our reading of Scripture, but I hope it's been encouraging for you to see that the stories of Scripture, the narrative of Scripture, is really deeply rooted in a particular time and place. It's deeply rooted in history. So thanks for watching.